And for the final time this year, Associate Professor Jason Byrne, Dr Tony Matthews, Urban Planners with the School of Environment at Griffith University, join me. A simple goodbye this afternoon. Gents, hello to you.
Hello, Matt.
Good afternoon, Matt.
How you doing?
Really good, thanks. How about you?
Excellent, excellent. To finish up this series, gents, you wanted to talk about the state of Australian cities, perhaps do a little gazing into a crystal ball and think about where we're headed, and indeed perhaps even give us a mark out of 10 here on the Gold Coast or something along those lines as to where we rate compared to the rest of the nation. Where's the best spot to begin this conversation?
In the past, I think.
OK, let's start there.
So, 30 years ago, before I was even at university, just about to hit university, I grabbed a book that Triple J were publishing at the time called Living for the City. And it was talking about what the state of Australian cities were back in the late 1980s. And they were looking into their crystal ball, thinking about the future. At that point, we had what we might call donut cities, right, Tony, where the cities were effectively emptied after dark.
Yeah, so the CBDs or the city cores were basically ghost towns after 5 p.m. There was nobody living there. There was no nighttime activity. Everybody retreated quickly to the suburbs, hence the term Donut City.
And the other problem we had at the time was we had a commercial property market that was in stress. People couldn't fill commercial office space in the city centre. We were not too far away from a recession at that point. And people started hatching the idea, well, what if we brought people back into the urban cores of our cities? What if we started building apartment buildings? What would that look like? And here we are today, living in that future that they were predicting back in those days.
Geez, we've filled in the donut, haven't we?
Well, we sure have. And we don't even need to encourage people to move into the middle of the donut anymore. We can barely keep them out now.
Yeah, indeed. What Australian cities are currently doing well from a planning perspective?
I think Brisbane is doing really well. I think Gold Coast is doing really well. I think we have a middle tier of cities then that could be doing really well, but aren't necessarily right now, but certainly have a lot of potential. And in there I would include the likes of Adelaide and Perth, Hobart, and maybe even Darwin. And, not to be controversial, but probably it will sound controversial, I think Sydney and Melbourne are actually not doing all that well overall. That's my own personal opinion, but if you look at places like Sydney and Melbourne, those two cities in particular, there's massive affordability problems, there's massive congestion problems, there's significant population strain, there's huge strain on resources and services. School places can't keep up with the number of children arriving into the city or being born into the city. People are spending longer in traffic, public transport is lagging, wages are not keeping pace with inflation.
Rising homelessness.
Rising homelessness. So in many metrics, Sydney and Melbourne are actually doing really poorly, and the smaller cities are doing much better. But, it's easy to argue against that too.
So Tony and I were having a bit of a chat about this, Matt, and we were thinking, in some ways you could look at Sydney and Melbourne and think about them as on the crest of a breaking wave. They've maxed out the good times in many respects. The housing affordability indexes are showing real strife across their populations. And other cities that people have tended to thumb their nose at in the past, like Hobart, for example, and being looked at with fresh eyes. And people are thinking, actually, I can get a really nice house close to downtown in Hobart for what I could pay for a broom closet in Sydney. And they're starting to reevaluate where they want to live. And increasingly the regional cities like Wollongong and Newcastle are filling out because they're close to these big CBDs in Sydney and Melbourne, but also cities like the Gold Coast are beginning to see an influx of migrants again as people start to reevaluate their choices. You can live in a very beautiful house on the Gold Coast and close to all these wonderful amenities, again, for what you could be a long way away from the CBD, stuck on a freeway for many hours in a day and in a hot suburb, not particularly happy in, say, Melbourne or Sydney on the far reaches. So it depends on the spectrum that you're looking at.
You mentioned that the Gold Coast was up there as a city that's going reasonably well. How do you measure that? What are your criteria for a city that's rating highly from a planning perspective?
Well, look, Gold Coast, and we've talked an awful lot about Gold Coast in the run of the urban squeeze, and we've always been very complimentary about it, and that's not just because we're broadcasting to Gold Coast, but, there's many good interventions going on there. Things like the light rail, that's really opening up parts of the Gold Coast. It'll especially be realising a wonderful vision happen once Phase 2 opens. Then you've got things like the Knowledge Precinct out around Griffith itself, where you've got the hospital and you're going to have a lot of the Commonwealth Games infrastructure. You're starting to see an awful lot of stuff that we've talked about in the past as well in Gold Coast, stuff like a lot more street art and public art, huge festival scene,
a rising cultural precinct with some big investment in a cultural precinct.
Some great eateries are opening up, night markets. All of these things are happening on Gold Coast outside of its traditional strengths in hospitality and tourism. These are all complementing its traditional strengths, and there's infrastructure and new housing to match, and it's not that congested and it's not that overpopulated, and it's got a beautiful climate.
91.7 ABC Gold Coast, final episode for 2017 of Urban Squeeze. Jason Byrne, Tony Matthews from Griffith University with me, Matt Webber. What are the drivers of change that you reckon will shape the future of Australian cities? And you can focus on the Goldie if you wish, but speak broadly if that's more convenient. Where are we going?
That's a great question, Matt. So when we started our first season of Urban Squeeze, the very first episode, we were looking at population, and we talked about how planet Earth is heading towards a population of 9 billion people, and that's going to remain a very big driver of influence on Australian cities. Right, Tony? I mean, we're seeing that already with housing.
Well, yeah. I mean, the population of Australia has gone up. I've been living here for a little more than 7 years, and I think the population's gone up by 3 or 4 million in that time alone, which is very significant when you consider that the population was 21 million or something when I arrived. It's close to 25 now. That's a huge increase.
I think the first time I was aware of an Australian population, it was 14 million.
Yeah, and we're talking about a big Australia now, right? It's been in the news for a while, this idea of 30 million plus. And when we look at a second driver, climate change, it's foreseeable that the two are interrelated. So, for example, we may see an influx of climate refugees coming from Pacific islands as they start to go under. And Tony and I were just talking about how, irrespective of the politics, you can't keep people out who are desperate and want to come here. And that's not to even think about just the natural increase, right, Tony, that's occurring in our cities too.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing about Australia is that the replacement rate, that is the birth rate, so the population replacement rate. So two people, who get together and have children, they're going to need at least 2 children just to replace themselves. But actually, we're not having enough children to replace our population. So that's one of the real reasons that we do so much organised migration into Australia, is because if we didn't, we wouldn't have a population to support ourselves in terms of a working population paying taxes and things like that. So that's one major driver. So global population's rising. Whether or not you buy into the big Australia philosophy, that's certainly going to have a flow-on effect to some degree on the Australian population, which is definitely going to continue to rise. And to be honest with you, it's a great country to live in. I can't see why anyone wouldn't want to live here. So there's always going to be a demand for living here. Whether or not people are going to start having larger families, I don't know. It's been a long time since we've been at replacement rate, so that's interesting. But one way or the other, the population of this country is going up. And whether that's driven by economic demand, whether it's driven by people seeking lifestyle, whether it's driven by more negative factors like Jason mentioned, climate refugees and things like that, it's hard to say exactly what will drive it, but we do know that that's going to go up, and that's going to have flow-on effects then for all kinds of urban services, not least housing provision.
Okay, name some of the others.
So another one that we've been talking about on this program, and it's been in the news a lot recently, and it's something that planning traditionally hasn't engaged with terribly well, but is now being forced to think about, is energy. So energy security is all over the news in the past few weeks. We're seeing Queensland bringing online a whole lot of solar power from large solar powered stations. We're seeing in the media Telstra, for example, wanting to escape rising energy prices by basically leasing energy in the future from solar power stations. So I think energy, Tony's got to be one of the big ones, right?
Yeah, and I mean even the federal government, who are notoriously resistant to the idea of renewable energy, have to acknowledge what the business community is saying, and what the business community are saying is that the cost of energy right now is a huge barrier to trade in this country. It's a huge economic burden for any business to be paying very, very high electricity prices, which are just constantly spiralling upwards. So the energy question has got to be answered.
It's a fascinating little junction that we've been pondering on, not just this segment, but in other discussions we've had on Drive recently, about how the market is becoming more forceful with how the energy debate is shaped, if you like. They're making decisions or making noise about decisions that kind of circumvent the need for government to really ponder these questions at all, in a sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think in many ways, government isn't even going to get a say here. The private sector is responding very fast, is recognising some of these just over the horizon major issues with energy security. We've seen in other parts of the world large storms wiping out energy distribution networks. Canada, not so long ago, had a huge snowstorm that brought down a lot of those high voltage overhead power transmission lines. We've seen that recently in South Australia. So the private sector's looking at that acutely and thinking we need to insulate ourselves against those risks, and it's starting to look at distributed energy. Tony?
Yeah, I think we're going to probably start seeing a lot more what we call microgrids. So, I mean, right now what we generally have is large energy plants, mostly coal-fired power plants, and they produce electricity which is then sent out hundreds of kilometres along distribution lines. Now, that system is very expansive and vulnerable, so a microgrid system is a more local-based form of energy provision and often connects back to renewable energy provision. So it's like you pool together all of the solar power that's generated by, the roofs of one house or all the houses in one neighbourhood, and that becomes your sort of feeds, 40% of your local supply. So even if your connection to the larger grid is interrupted, you still have a 40% supply potential and things like that. So we're going to see a lot more of that. A lot of companies are taking responsibility for their own energy independence. They're using the land that their offices are built on, for example, to put up more solar panels, try and feed into the office themselves. Factories are going the same way. So government is, they can say or think or take whatever position they like on this, but as we've said, or as we've acknowledged, the market is moving forcefully ahead.
And Matt, this is a really nice segue maybe into the next point. We're seeing a change in technology that we didn't quite foresee would happen so quickly. So, for example, battery storage. There's now a very competitive market emerging around battery storage, which gives not just individual homeowners, but indeed companies the ability to go offline from the grid. And I think these sorts of technologies are going to profoundly reshape Australian cities over the next 20 to 30 years. So Tony and I have been talking about not just battery storage, but even automation. On this show, we've talked, for example, about the idea of 3D printing buildings, new building technologies, but Tony, smart cities is an increasing theme that we've been picking up as well.
Very big theme in Brisbane, the smart city concept. I know that for a fact.
The smart city concept is gaining traction all over the world, and I mean we talked a little. I think we did a show in season 1 on smart cities, but we're seeing this happen much more quickly probably than we would have anticipated it's happening. So the extent of urban management that's being handed over to technology now is really quite staggering, and we're really only at the very thin end of that wedge. So if you think about our traffic management systems and our utility systems and things like that, increasingly now are being run by very, very sophisticated software programs running very, very complex algorithms, and human decision making is being more and more removed from these systems, or is being put in there as a sort of a crisis management strategy rather than a first option. And that's only the start of it. It's only we're only probably a few years away, realistically, from starting to see automated vehicles taking to the roads forcefully. In fact, I was talking to a guy the other day who sells Mercedes for a living, and he was saying that the automation available in the top-level Mercedes right now can't be activated. It's built into the cars, but it can't be switched on because legislators haven't created a legal context for it yet. But he was saying that what's already in cars now goes far beyond even our imagination. So it's already here. We just have to figure out how to actually make avenues of governance and legality for it. And that's another one of these market demands that government is just going to have to really start paying attention to.
And Matt, we can extrapolate from this trend as well. So part of planning is not just in the next 2 or 3 years, but indeed in the next 30, 40, 50 years. So what we saw in the 1980s was a profound change in how land was used in the urban core. We've just mentioned that at the beginning of the show. If we see some of these changes in transport automation, it's not too hard to begin to re-envisage our cities using their freeway systems differently. So freeways are no longer noisy because vehicle fleets are predominantly electric. If we don't need to have all those lanes on the freeway because algorithms are running cars and the cars are effectively turning into virtual trains, that a car might swing past you, pick you up, a driverless vehicle, take you on a freeway, hook up with a whole heap of other vehicles in a kind of virtual train. That will free up lanes on freeways, and next to freeways some space, and underneath freeways. And we may begin to see a kind of radical change in how those freeways are used as well. Maybe housing, Tony, or maybe energy generation, or even food growing.
Yeah, all of these things are not just possibilities, but in many ways they're likelihoods. And I mean, if you to take the focus to another city, you look at somewhere like Adelaide right now, which is, doesn't really know whether it's moving forwards or backwards. That's my reading of Adelaide. They've been sort of in some sort of crisis management mode ever since the manufacturing industry started to close down. They're sort of desperate for the submarine building contracts and stuff like that down there. But if that doesn't happen, what are they going to do? Well, one thing that somewhere like Adelaide could do to make itself incredibly successful and relevant, not just in Australia but globally, is to really become a test bed, for example, for some of this automation, but backed by renewable energy. They're already way down the renewable energy road. If they were to combine that with automation and reduce the scale of it almost down to the household level, so you're connecting houses to electric cars and automated electric cars, they could potentially transform themselves almost into a Silicon Valley of the Southern Hemisphere.
And there's a link again with energy, right, Tony? So we've seen some recent technologies, Matt, that have been talked about, some big breakthroughs with the CSIRO, where they've figured out a new way to ship hydrogen across the ocean. Hydrogen's very unstable. We just look at the Hindenburg and what happened there. But if you convert hydrogen into other forms of gas, like ammonia, that can then be shipped safely from one place to another and then broken down again at the other end into hydrogen. So we're seeing a move towards maybe a hydrogen economy, but you need lots of sunshine to generate the electricity to do those processes with hydrogen conversion, and Adelaide is ideally suited for those kinds of technologies.
You're freaking me out, you two. You're blowing my mind. You're blowing my mind.
That's what we do best.
Guys, it's always wonderful to have you on, and I really appreciate your hard work and your commitment for Series 2. I love how you break it into series, so it makes me feel like I'm part of House of Cards or something.
Yeah.
Evil plans for next year, mate.
Evil plans for next year will involve you one way or another. Gentlemen, a pleasure having you on as always, and wonderful insights as usual. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Cheers. Associate Professor Jason Byrne, Dr. Tony Matthews. That's Urban Squeeze for 2017.